Are you a music theorist, orchestrator, or composer wondering if you're writing or orchestrating anything that's unplayable? Or are you preparing to move on to more ambitious orchestrations and want to know the basics? Here's the top 5 mistakes to avoid when orchestrating your works for symphony orchestra. Let's jump right into it at mistake number 1, which is writing too loudly for the brass in contrast to the rest of the orchestra. This is a mistake I don't think is acknowledged enough in our modern world of MIDI playback. The symphony orchestra, as you may know, is composed of 4 distinct families: the woodwinds, the brass, the percussion, and the strings. Now, if all of these sections were to play as loudly as they possibly could, the brass section would absolutely be the most prominent and quite physically the loudest. This is because the trumpet and the trombone are the loudest instruments in the orchestra, with the horns and tuba also packing quite a punch. You might be thinking to yourself, so what that they're the loudest? Well, if you have the rest of the orchestra decreasing in volume, or remaining at any volume other than forte and beyond, and have your brass section come in blaring, it's going to be jarring to your audience and completely engulf the rest of the orchestra. This is not to be confused with instances like Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, Movement 1, where the trumpets initiate a jump scare in the middle of the first movement. This was done with the intent of creating a jolt in the audience. So unless that's your scenario, I would always be sure to balance the brass according to what the rest of the orchestra is playing, so the entirety of your masterpiece can be audible. Time for mistake number 2, which is composing too loudly for the flutes in their lowest register. The flute rests at the top of the orchestral score beneath the piccolo, and has a gorgeous but varying sound across its range. This range extends down to a C3, assuming C3 represents middle C, and moves all the way up to around a C6, respectively. Many people overestimate the ability of flute players in the lowest fourth of this range, and will write too loudly for this register. Even the best flute players physically cannot play these notes at a high volume. Keep it to about a mezzo piano to a mezzo forte at most in this bottom fourth. Moving on to mistake number 3, which I see far too often in band scores since they lack a violin section, is writing too high for the oboes in extended passages. The oboe lies right below the flute on the orchestral score, and for this reason its range is assumed to be the same as a flute's by proxy. Here's the actual range of an oboe. Looks pretty high, right? But there's a very clear disclaimer at the bottom that reads, "Some higher notes may occasionally be achieved on oboe, but they are unreliable." This chart came from AndrewHugel.com, which ranks second on Google, so it can be assumed to be credible. So the next time you're writing a finale and feel like doubling the flutes and oboes in unison, be mindful that the range of an oboe is inconsistent as you add more ledger lines. The fourth mistake that I come across is simply lacking knowledge of string properties in string instruments. The 2 most important strings on any string instrument are the first and last string, or the outside strings. Let's take the cello for instance. There are 4 strings total: the C string, G string, D string, and A string. The C string provides a rather deep and rich sound, full of intensity and power. The topmost A string has a brilliant and mystifying sound which is nothing short of incredible for solo writing. Now the 2 middle strings, however, don't have as much of a distinct and captivating sound and are not quite as good for solo writing. This property is applicable to all of the string instruments within the orchestra. So where does the orchestration mistake present itself here? Let's use Brahms' Third Symphony as an example. Here you'll find a piano reduction of the third movement. As you might be able to tell, the melody line occurs in the left-hand part of the first piano, while the other parts play accompaniment. Here's a little quiz you can figure out using the aforementioned string principle. Which string part actually plays the melody? If you guessed violin, or even viola, because the melody is written in treble clef, I don't blame you, but that's incorrect. The solo part is written for the cello, since it will entirely be played on that top A string we were talking about. If it were to be played on either violin or viola, it would sound bland and wouldn't maximize the potential of your string section. So the takeaway here? Make sure you aren't writing solos on nondescript middle strings, as they will definitely be overshadowed and dull sounding. If you've managed to stick around this long, give yourself a pat on the back for being a truly dedicated orchestrator. The 5th mistake is one that I run into a lot as a brass player, and that's not allotting enough time for breathing and lip rest in your wind and especially brass instruments. Writing in a software like Finale or Sibelius makes it tempting to fill out your score with constant wind and brass melodies, But the fact of the matter is, every wind or brass player has a certain stamina that varies by instrument and ability level. Take your performers into consideration when planning out your bars of rest. Thank you so much for tuning in, and if you've learned anything today, be sure to hit subscribe and tap on that bell icon for more music theory and composition tips in the future. Until then, I'll see you next time.